Okay, let's unpack this. Because imagine you're lying on an operating table.
Right.
The lights above you are just blindingly bright. Your heart has been temporarily stopped by a surgical team. And right now, a machine is breathing for you.
Yeah, a completely mechanical process.
Exactly. Another complex arrangement of like pumps and tubes is circulating your blood. And in this incredibly vulnerable moment, your life doesn't just depend on the brilliant surgeon holding the scalpel.
Not at all.
It depends on the structural integrity of a tiny, invisible, maybe 50-cent spring vibrating inside a plastic casing. And today, for our deep dive, we are looking at the people who ensure that spring doesn't snap.
And that invisible infrastructure is just, well, it's something we take entirely for granted.
Oh, totally.
We tend to view healing as this intimate biological event,
Yeah.
between a patient and a doctor. We rarely consider the dense, really unforgiving layer of physics and electricity standing right between them.
Yeah, which brings us to today's source material. We're diving into a really fascinating memoir by Joe Bandra called Body, Mind, and Machine: My Personal Journey in Clinical Engineering and the Evolution of Healthcare Technology Management.
It's a fantastic read. It really functions as a witness statement to the birth of an entire discipline.
I mean, it documents this crazy transition of medicine from a purely observational art into a highly mechanized science.
Exactly.
So our mission today is to explore these silent guardians, right? The people who translate the cold language of engineering into the warm language of care. For everyone listening, we're going to look under the hood of the machines keeping us alive.
Unpack how they actually work.
Yes. Who makes sure they don't fail, and what all of this means for the future of your own healthcare. If you've ever been hooked up to a hospital monitor or, slid inside the dark tunnel of an MRI scanner, this deep dive is going to fundamentally change how you look at that experience.
To really grasp the magnitude of Bandra's work, we have to recognize that for the vast majority of human history, medicine and engineering existed on completely divergent tracks.
Right, they were totally separate.
Exactly. A physician in the 19th century worked entirely through intuition, touch, accumulated biological experience. Their world was mapped by symptoms: a fevered brow, a weak pulse, a cough.
And the engineers of that same era they were off building railroads.
Railroads, steel factories, telegraph networks, they dealt in measurable tolerances.
Sure.
Math, equations, thermodynamics, metal, electricity. The two worlds did not speak the same language at all.
No. And the way I picture it's like dropping a complex, unpredictable alien spaceship into a quiet village.
That's a great analogy.
I mean, the doctors knew human biology inside and out, but suddenly they had to manage the laws of physics because this collision really accelerated post-World War II, right?
Yeah, it did. Hospitals transformed into these dense technological ecosystems almost overnight. Physics suddenly offered profound new tools: radiation therapy, advanced imaging, complex instrumentation.
But there was a massive problem.
A huge structural problem. Many of those early medical technologies, like the first generation of mechanical ventilators or defibrillators, they were actually repurposed from military or heavy industrial applications.
Which is just wild. I mean, asking a master chef to suddenly repair the internal circuitry of a commercial microwave? The chef knows exactly how the food reacts to the heat, but they have absolutely no idea how the magnetron is generating the electromagnetic waves.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize the disconnect.
Because doctors were suddenly handed equipment that behaved according to the ruthless laws of physics, not the forgiving nuances of clinical intuition.
Right, and when a biological system fails, it often degrades slowly. You have time to react.
But a machine...
When an electrical system fails, it happens in a millisecond, often catastrophically.
The book talks about this.
Yeah, in the 50s and 60s, the literature is filled with horrific accidents. Patients were electrocuted by early monitoring equipment because the engineers who built them didn't understand that a hospital bed needed different grounding protocols than a factory floor.
Oh, wow.
Infusion pumps delivered lethal volumes of medication because of simple mechanical drift in the gears.
It wasn't that the doctors lacked compassion. It was just a total failure of integration. They didn't have the training to troubleshoot a failing machine.
And that void is precisely where the clinical engineer was born. The hospital needed someone who could stand at the bedside, look at the doctor, look at the machine, and understand the language of both.
It's like they had to be bilingual.
Exactly. But to appreciate the complexity of the modern ICU, we really should trace the lineage of these healing tools. We need to look at the foundational inventions that first bridged that gap between raw physics and the human body.
I am so glad you brought that up. Because the historical milestones in this book totally reframed how I see everyday medical tools.
They really do.
Like the thermometer. It seems like the most basic thing in the world. A nurse pops it under your tongue or scans your forehead. But the mechanics behind measuring human heat didn't start in a hospital at all, did they?
No, not at all. They started in the realm of astronomy and physics.
Galileo, right.
Yes, in the late 1500s, Galilei built the first thermoscope. He utilized a fundamental law of physics, thermal expansion. He took a glass tube with a bulb at the end and placed the open end in water.
Okay.
As the air inside the bulb was heated, say, by a patient holding it, the air expanded, pushing the water down the tube.
But a glass of water moving up and down doesn't actually give you a temperature, does it? I mean, it just tells you if something is getting hotter or colder.
That was the limitation. It showed motion, but it lacked a standardized scale. It was a qualitative observation, not a quantitative measurement.
So how do we get numbers?
It took over a century for a Polish-German physicist named Daniel Gabriel Fahrenheit to refine the mechanics.
Oh, Fahrenheit,
Yeah.
obviously.
Right. He realized that water was inconsistent. It froze too easily and expanded unpredictably near its freezing point, so he switched to mercury.
Which is a liquid metal.
Exactly, a liquid metal that expands with beautiful, linear consistency across a massive temperature range. He then established a rigid mathematical scale, pegging the freezing point of a specific brine solution at 0 and the boiling point of water at 212.
What's fascinating here is that before that specific mechanical standardization, doctors relied purely on subjective feeling.
Absolutely. One doctor's slight fever was another doctor's burning up.
But the mercury thermometer brought absolute objectivity. It meant an illness could be charted. A fever breaking was no longer a guess. It was a measurable downward trend on a mathematical graph.
It bridged human suffering with mathematical precision.
Yeah, and moving from temperature to sound, the stethoscope provides another brilliant example of physics solving a clinical barrier.
It's a great story. In 1816 Paris, a French physician named René Laennec faced a really delicate problem.
This is the story about the rolled up paper, right? I've always wondered how listening to the chest actually worked before that invention. Did doctors just, guess what the heart sounded like?
Well, they practiced something called immediate auscultation, which literally meant placing their ear directly against the patient's chest.
Oh, that sounds awkward.
It was. And Laennec was examining a young woman with symptoms of heart disease.
Hmm.
Societal norms regarding modesty made him incredibly reluctant to press his ear to her chest.
So he rolls up a piece of paper into a tight cylinder. But how does a hollow tube of paper actually amplify a heartbeat? I don't get the physics there.
It comes down to acoustic impedance. When a doctor places their ear near a chest, the sound waves of the beating heart have to travel through tissue, then into the air, and then to the ear.
Okay.
Air is a terrible conductor of sound compared to a solid because its molecules are spread far apart. Much of the sound energy simply dissipates.
So the sound just gets lost in the air gap.
Precisely. Laennec remembered this principle from playing with wooden beams as a child. By creating a tight, solid tube, he provided a direct, contained pathway for the acoustic energy to travel from the patient's chest to his eardrum without dispersing into the surrounding air.
That is so smart. He eventually built a wooden cylinder, which he named the stethoscope, and a hollow piece of wood completely changed the culture of medicine.
It really did.
I mean, a doctor could diagnose tuberculosis or a heart murmur without ever making an incision.
It essentially turned the act of listening into a highly calibrated form of diagnostic empathy.
Diagnostic empathy. I like that. Now, I want to look at another tool the book highlights, one that moves beyond just observing the body and actually penetrates it, the hypodermic needle.
Ah, yes.
The book mentions it was inspired by a bug.
Yes. In 1853, a Scottish physician named Alexander Wood was trying to solve a massive problem in pain management. Morphine had been isolated, but administering it was incredibly inefficient.
Because you had to swallow it?
Right. If a patient swallowed it, the drug had to survive the harsh acids of the stomach and pass through the liver. It's a process called first-pass metabolism. Only a fraction of it finally reached the bloodstream.
So it was slow and unpredictable.
Exactly. Wood was observing the mechanics of a bee sting. A bee possesses a microscopic, hollow stinger that injects venom directly into the tissue, entirely bypassing the victim's external defenses.
So he decided to build a mechanical stinger.
He collaborated with a manufacturer to design a microscopic hollow steel tube, sharp enough to part human tissue without tearing it, attached to a small glass syringe.
Wow.
And around the exact same time, a French surgeon named Charles Pervaz independently invented a very similar device.
I mean, think about the fluid dynamics involved in that. You have to push a thick liquid through a tiny steel tube without the pressure shattering the glass syringe. It is a brilliant paradox.
It really is.
A sharp piece of metal that causes a momentary pinch, but bypasses the entire digestive system to deliver life-saving medicine directly into the circulatory system in seconds.
The precision engineering of that hollow needle is what makes rapid trauma response possible today. But perhaps the most profound early intersection of engineering and compassion is the infant incubator.
This is wild. The idea for the hospital incubator actually came from a trip to a zoo.
Yeah. In 1880, a French obstetrician named Stéphane Tarnier was visiting a zoo in Paris. He observed an enclosure containing a poultry incubator.
Like for hatching chickens.
Exactly. A simple wooden box with a heated water compartment used to hatch bird eggs. It maintained a perfectly steady microclimate of heat and humidity.
Which is crucial.
Yes, because at that time in medical history, the survival of a premature human baby was left largely to fate. The infants lacked the body fat to regulate their own temperature.
So they would just freeze.
They routinely succumbed to hypothermia from simple drafts in the maternity wards.
That's heartbreaking. So Tarnier looks at the bird eggs and realizes that a premature baby is facing the exact same thermodynamic problem. They are losing heat faster than their tiny metabolism can generate it.
Right. He essentially commissioned an instrument maker to build a human-sized version of the poultry incubator. A sealed, double-walled wooden box warmed by a reservoir of hot water.
And it worked.
The results were staggering. This simple application of thermodynamics reduced premature infant mortality in his ward by nearly 50%.
50%. But the way this technology spread globally is one of the strangest stories in medical history, because it didn't spread through medical journals, did it?
No, it spread through carnival sideshows.
Yes. The early 1900s, hospitals were incredibly skeptical of the incubators. They thought it was like unnatural.
They rejected it.
So a physician named Martin County set up infant incubator exhibits at international expositions and eventually a permanent installation at Coney Island.
It's hard to believe now.
People paid a dime for admission to walk through a gallery and look through glass windows at actual premature babies being kept alive in these mechanical environments.
It sounds exploitative to modern ears. But County didn't charge the parents a single cent for the care. The admission fees paid for the nurses, the equipment, and the massive amounts of electricity needed to run the heaters.
The public spectacle directly funded the clinical trial of the technology.
Exactly. The public was fascinated by the sheer audacity of it. And that leads to the pioneers who started looking at internal organs as mechanical puzzles to be solved. We have to talk about the artificial kidney.
Oh, this one is amazing.
During World War II, a Dutch physician named Willem Kolff was watching patients die of acute kidney failure. The biological kidneys function as the body's filtration system.
Right.
When they fail, toxins like urea build up in the blood until they reach lethal levels. Kolff refused to accept this as an unavoidable death sentence. He analyzed the kidney not as a mysterious biological organ, but as a mechanical filter.
I read the description of what he built, and it sounds like something out of a junkyard. I mean, he used washing machine parts and sausage casings.
He did.
How does a sausage casing filter human blood? That makes no sense.
It relies on a principle called osmosis and semi-permeable membranes. Cellophane sausage casings are not completely solid. Under a microscope, they are porous.
Okay, they have tiny holes.
Yes. Kolff realized that if he pumped a patient's toxic blood through a long tube of cellophane and submerged that tube in a bath of sterile, salted water, the tiny toxin molecules would slip out through the microscopic pores into the bath.
Oh, wow.
But the vital red blood cells and large proteins were too big to fit through the holes, so they remained safely inside the tube to be returned to the patient's body.
That is genius. He wrapped yards of this cellophane around a wooden drum, powered it with a motor salvaged from a washing machine, and used bathtubs as his fluid reservoirs.
It was incredibly makeshift.
It was clunky, it was loud, and the first few patients didn't survive, sadly. But in 1945, he hooked up a woman in a coma from kidney failure. After hours of mechanical filtration, her blood was cleared of toxins. She woke up and she lived for several more years.
He built a machine that did the work of an internal organ.
Yeah, and you see a similar leap with Earl Bakken in the 1950s.
The pacemaker.
Right. The electrical conduction system of the heart is essentially a biological pacemaker. When it fails, the heart stops. At the time, doctors kept patients alive by plugging them into massive wall-powered pacemakers that looked like television sets.
which tethered the patient to the wall.
Exactly. But during a severe storm, a power outage in the hospital killed a child attached to one of these machines. Bakken, who was an electrical engineer, was devastated.
So what did he do?
He looked at the problem and utilized the newly invented transistor to build a miniaturized battery-powered pacemaker the size of a shirt pocket.
What's fascinating here is that even if the city grid went down, the patient's heart kept beating.
It was completely autonomous.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Kolff and Vakken represent the true ethos of clinical engineering. They didn't just build objects, they analyzed human suffering, broke it down into its constituent laws of physics, fluid dynamics, electrical conductivity, and engineered a mechanical bypass. They designed possibilities where biology had declared a dead end.
Which brings us directly back to Joe Bandra. We've talked about the grand, sweeping history of these inventions, but reading about Bandra's personal initiation into this field grounds it entirely in reality.
It really does.
I am trying to picture being a young engineering graduate and suddenly being handed the responsibility of fixing these machines. How did he actually learn not to kill people with this equipment?
Well, he didn't learn in a pristine, sterile laboratory. He started at the absolute bottom, in a heavily industrial environment. His first major job was at General Electric, tasked with overhauling portable X-ray tubes.
The sensory details he provides about that workshop are incredible.
Yeah, so
Very visceral. He describes the heavy smell of machine oil, the dust, and the sharp metallic tang of ozone in the air from the high voltage. Let's break down what's actually inside one of those X-ray tubes, because it is not just taking a photograph with a flash.
not at all. Producing an X-ray is an incredibly violent physical process. Inside that rugged steel and lead casing is a glass vacuum tube.
Okay.
You have a cathode, which fires a high-speed beam of electrons across the vacuum, slamming them into a tungsten target called the anode.
Like a particle accelerator in miniature.
Exactly. When those electrons hit the tungsten, they decelerate instantly, releasing a burst of energy in the form of X-ray photons. But that collision is wildly inefficient. About 99% of the energy generated is pure heat. Only 1% becomes the X-ray beam.
Wait, 99% is heat. If you are generating that much heat, the machine is basically a bomb waiting to go off if it's not cooled properly.
Precisely. That's why the entire tube assembly is submerged in specialized cooling oil.
Ah, that explains the oil smell.
Yes. Bandra's job was to tear these heavy military-grade devices down to the absolute bare metal. He had to inspect the electrical contacts, test the massive high-voltage transformers for any microscopic leakage, and replace the rubber gaskets holding the cooling oil.
And if he misses something?
A failure in any one of those systems doesn't just mean a blurry image. It means the glass tube could shatter, or the operator could receive a lethal electric shock.
He writes about how he had to learn the anatomy of these machines exactly the way a medical student learns the human body. He had to understand the vascular system of the cooling oil, the nervous system of the electrical relays, and the skeletal structure of the lead shielding.
He was learning that in clinical engineering, a failure in a minor subsystem almost always cascades into a total catastrophic failure of the primary function.
So what does this all mean for him as a young professional? It meant realizing the immense ethical burden of his wrench.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. Every bolt he tightened, every seal he checked, was a moral obligation to an unseen patient. He knew that weeks later, a doctor was going to look at a film produced by his machine to decide if a patient had a tumor. If his calibration was weak, the tumor doesn't show up on the film. If his calibration was too strong, he delivers an unsafe dose of radiation.
Precision wasn't just a corporate mandate. It was the entire foundation of patient trust.
Yeah. And that philosophy of moral precision was put to a severe test early in his career during a crisis at a nearby hospital. This is a sequence in the memoir that perfectly illustrates the concept of engineered problem solving under extreme constraint.
Oh, you're talking about the ballpoint pen
The
incident.
ballpoint pen incident, I love this story.
Yeah.
So Bandra gets a frantic call from a radiology clinic. Their primary GE X-ray table is completely out of commission. The waiting room is overflowing, patients are becoming distressed, and the entire diagnostic schedule for the hospital is backing up.
Total chaos.
Bandra rushes over, opens up the massive table, and checks the high-voltage systems. The electronics are fine, the motors are fine, but the Bucky tray is broken. What exactly does a Bucky tray do?
To get a clear X-ray image, you have to place the film directly beneath the patient. But as X-rays pass through human tissue, some of the photons scatter in random directions.
Like light through fog.
Exactly. If those scattered photons hit the film, the image becomes foggy and unreadable. The Bucky tray holds an anti-scatter grid, a series of incredibly thin lead strips that absorb the scattered radiation before it hits the film. For the grid to work, the tray has to lock into place with absolute rigidity.
And Bandra discovers that the tray won't lock because of one missing piece. A tiny, finger-sized tension spring has snapped. A piece of coiled metal worth maybe 50 cents has paralyzed a multi-million-dollar diagnostic operation.
And standard procedure dictates that he must order the official replacement part from General Electric, which will take several days to arrive.
Meaning the clinic remains shut down for days and patients don't get their diagnoses. But Bandra looks down at his shirt pocket. He is carrying a cheap, retractable ballpoint pen.
A standard office pen.
He takes the pen apart, extracts the tiny coil spring that pushes the ink cartridge up and down, uses his pliers to trim it, and installs the pen spring into the Bucky tray of the X-ray machine. The tray locks perfectly. The clinic resumes operation.
It's a brilliant improvisation.
Now I have to challenge this. You just explained how dangerous X-ray machines are, how 99% of the energy is heat and high voltage. In a highly regulated hospital environment, isn't it wildly reckless, maybe even illegal, to just MacGyver a piece of medical equipment with office supplies?
That is the exact question a regulatory auditor would ask.
Right.
But the answer lies in a foundational engineering principle called functional equivalence.
Functional equivalent.
Right. Bandra wasn't blindly guessing. He analyzed the physics of the failed component. What was the spring's actual job? It wasn't conducting electricity. It wasn't holding back high-pressure oil. Its sole purpose was to provide a specific, mild mechanical counterforce to hold a latch in place according to Hooke's law of elasticity.
It just needed to push back with a specific amount of tension.
Exactly. That requirement is a law of physics, not a GE proprietary patent. The coil inside the ballpoint pen, once trimmed to the correct length, provided the exact mechanical counterforce required by the physics of the latch. He understood the mechanism, not just the part number.
But he didn't just leave it there and walk away.
And that is where he draws the critical ethical boundary. Creativity without rigorous accountability is incredibly dangerous. Bandra made it explicitly clear to the radiology staff that this was a temporary, improvised fix. He documented the intervention meticulously. And the absolute moment the official GE replacement spring arrived on site days later, he went back, removed the pen spring, and installed the certified component. He bought the hospital 3 days of operational continuity without introducing any unacceptable risk to the patients.
That is such a vital distinction. He didn't just duct tape it and forget about it.
No, the accountability was there.
The pen spring was a brilliant lesson in how a microscopic mechanical failure impacts a single clinic. But Bandra's next major encounter with the machine would force him to think about the impact of technology on a massive global scale.
Yes, his work with the Cobalt-60 unit.
Just the name Cobalt-60 sounds intimidating. Bandra is sent to an oncology ward to service this machine. It is a massive, heavy steel gantry used for radiation therapy. We talked about X-rays, but how does gamma radiation actually fight cancer?
It relies on the physics of radioactive decay. Cobalt-60 is an unstable synthetic isotope. As it decays, it naturally emits incredibly high-energy gamma rays.
Okay.
These rays have the power to penetrate deep into human tissue and ionize the water molecules inside cells, creating free radicals that literally shred the DNA of the cancer cells, preventing them from dividing.
But gamma rays don't know the difference between a cancer cell and a healthy heart cell. If the beam hits the wrong spot, it destroys healthy tissue.
Which is why the geometry of the machine is so complex. The cobalt source is housed in a massive lead head. The machine rotates around the patient in a 360-degree arc, firing the beam from multiple different angles.
Oh, so it intersects.
Exactly. The beams intersect exactly at the site of the tumor. So the surrounding healthy tissue only gets a fleeting dose of radiation, but the tumor itself receives the cumulative lethal dose from every angle.
And the math behind it is constantly shifting, isn't it? Because the radiation source is literally decaying while it sits there.
Cobalt-60 has a half-life of about 5.27 years. That means every single month, the source is slightly weaker than it was the month before. Bandra had to calculate the dose rates, the tissue depth, and the geometric exposure times, adjusting for that mathematical decay.
And if he's wrong?
If his calculations are off by a fraction of a percent, the patient either wouldn't receive enough radiation to kill the tumor, or they would receive a toxic overdose that could kill them. The margin between poison and cure was entirely determined by his math.
It is an immense psychological burden. So he finishes this brutal calibration and he steps out of the hospital in India exhausted. He just wants a moment of normalcy. He walks across the street to a neighborhood Irani cafe.
A classic Bombay cafe.
Yeah, he describes the lazy ceiling fans, the smell of yeast and tea leaves. He orders a glass of strong Irani chai and bun muska, this thick, buttered bread.
It is a moment of profound grounding after dealing with the invisible lethality of gamma rays. But the quiet is interrupted when a man named Kamal sits down at his table.
Kamal is a vice president for a major medical distributor based in Delhi, and Kamal starts sketching out the macroeconomic reality of healthcare in India in the early 1980s. The middle class is expanding, and the demand for world-class healthcare is exploding. Hospitals across the country are suddenly writing massive checks for advanced Western machinery, ventilators, anesthesia workstations, complex imaging scanners.
But Kamal identifies the fatal flaw in this economic boom. He tells Bondra that purchasing a crate of advanced technology is useless if you don't have the infrastructure to sustain it.
Right.
If you drop a highly sensitive computerized anesthesia machine into a regional hospital in India that experiences severe, unpredictable voltage spikes on the local power grid, the machine will fry its motherboard in a week.
And the local doctors won't know how to fix it.
Exactly.
Huh.
Kamal realized that what India desperately needed were translators. They needed engineers like Bondra who understood the high-level physics of the Western machinery, but also deeply understood the local, unforgiving realities of the developing clinical environment.
So right there, over a cup of tea, Kamal offers Bondra a job in Bombay to act as a bridge between the international sales teams and the local hospital wards.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, consider the implications of that job offer. Bondra wasn't just being offered a promotion, he was stepping into the front lines of the global reconfiguration of healthcare. This was occurring during the era of Jack Welch taking over as the CEO of General Electric.
The book spends a lot of time on Welch's philosophy, his famous mandates like change before you have to and control your destiny or someone else will.
Yes. Under Welch's aggressive leadership, GE pivoted heavily into manufacturing advanced medical technologies, and they viewed massive markets like Asia and Latin America as their prime targets.
But they hit a wall.
GE quickly realized that you cannot simply export technology without exporting localized expertise. An MRI machine shipped from a pristine factory in Milwaukee is a useless hunk of magnets if the local engineer in Bombay doesn't know how to shield the room from local radio frequencies, or how to train the hospital staff without drowning them in untranslatable jargon.
So Bondra takes the job. He leaves the quiet workshop behind and steps into the global arena. This journey eventually takes him from the chaotic, humid streets of Bombay to the intellectual, polished corridors of Boston, and finally to the raw, visceral reality of Cook County Hospital in Chicago.
Cook County Hospital in the 1990s occupies a legendary place in American medical history. It was one of the largest, busiest, and most notoriously overwhelmed public trauma centers in the country.
The scene Bondra paints is incredibly intense. He moves into an apartment right across the street from the hospital near the Cabrini Green public housing projects. He describes the soundtrack of his life as an endless loop of ambulance sirens. The trauma bays are constantly filled with the young victims of gang violence, drug overdoses, and extreme poverty. It is a massive, crumbling, under-resourced fortress of a hospital that operates on one unyielding rule: they turn absolutely no one away.
Stepping into that environment as the new clinical engineer, you might expect his first assignment to involve a highly sophisticated million-dollar piece of surgical equipment.
Instead, he is handed a clipboard and told to locate and overhaul hundreds of old, battered Gonco suction pumps that have been scattered across the massive hospital campus. It is the least glamorous, most tedious job imaginable.
A suction pump is mechanically rudimentary. It is essentially an electric motor attached to a vacuum pump and a collection canister. But in a trauma bay, its biological function is paramount.
Why is it so critical?
It operates on Boyle's law, utilizing negative pressure to draw fluids out of a space. When a gunshot victim is wheeled into the trauma bay or a patient is actively coding and choking on their own blood or vomit, the physician cannot secure an airway to insert a breathing tube until the airway is clear.
Ah, so it literally clears the path.
Yes. The suction pump clears the field. It buys the physician the crucial seconds needed to establish a lifeline.
Bandra spends weeks tracking these dented pumps down. He tears them apart on his workbench. He cleans the dried biohazards off the gaskets, tests the electrical limits of the motors, and replaces the worn-out vacuum seals. He realizes that by restoring the negative pressure to these simple machines, he is literally rebuilding the lungs of the hospital.
Which is a beautiful way to see it.
It was exhausting, repetitive labor, but he understood the stakes. Every time he put a green certified sticker on a pump and sent it back to the ward, he was making a promise to a terrified nurse that when they reached for that switch in a moment of sheer panic, the motor would engage.
Establishing that baseline mechanical reliability is the first step in surviving a chaotic environment. But Bandra also engaged in a fascinating psychological strategy to manage the chaos of Cook County.
I was absolutely captivated by this detail. In a hospital where literal blood is on the floor and trauma teams are running on adrenaline and zero sleep, the book makes a huge point out of the fact that Bandra wore a tie every single day.
Every single day.
Not just a tie, but a meticulously curated collection. He owned over 100 of them. Stripes, solids, bright paisleys. He would actually select his tie in the morning based on what he perceived the morale of the hospital would be that day. Why put so much effort into a polished shoe and a silk tie when your job requires you to get elbow deep in the greasy internals of a broken machine?
It comes down to signaling theory and the psychology of professionalism. In an under-resourced public hospital, anxiety is highly contagious. A relatively calm morning can violently pivot into a mass casualty event by lunchtime.
Right.
When an essential piece of life support equipment alarms and fails, the clinical staff experience a spike of sheer terror. When the engineer walks onto that ward to fix it, everyone is watching them.
If the engineer runs in looking disheveled, sweating, with a stained shirt, it just amplifies the feeling that the system is collapsing.
Precisely. An unkempt appearance signals to the staff that the chaos has breached the containment walls. But when Bandra walked onto a frantic ward in a crisp shirt, a polished shoe, and a vibrant tie, projecting absolute unbothered calm, it served as a visual anchor.
A grounding presence.
Before he even touched the machine, his appearance transmitted a psychological message to the exhausted doctors and nurses. I am not overwhelmed by your emergency. I am prepared. I understand the physics of this machine, and I will restore order. You can trust me.
He was using his wardrobe to inject dignity back into a desperate environment. And speaking of dignity, the book recounts a specific historical moment at Cook County that perfectly illustrates the ultimate limitation of all this incredible technology. The visit from Princess Diana.
Yes, in the summer of 1996, it was a profoundly disruptive event for the hospital.
Princess Diana was a global icon, and instead of just attending a high society gala in Chicago, she specifically requested to walk the grueling, depressing wards of Cook County Hospital. Bandra observes this from the sidelines, and he notes an incredible phenomenon.
The shift in the atmosphere.
Yes. The moment she entered the hospital, the entire atmospheric pressure of the building seemed to shift. Nurses who had spent decades building emotional armor against the relentless trauma suddenly softened. Patients who were languishing in pain sat up straighter. The heavy, metallic air of the hospital just felt lighter because she was there, looking them in the eye, holding their hands.
Bandra spent his entire career obsessing over mechanical precision. He knew exactly how many volts were required to restart a heart, or how much negative pressure was needed to clear an airway. He knew that precision was what kept the patients biologically alive. But witnessing Diana's interaction with the patients forced him to confront a profound philosophical reality.
Which is what?
That machines can sustain biological life, but they cannot affirm human life. A ventilator can force oxygen into the alveoli of the lungs, but it cannot make the patient feel that their life is worth fighting for.
Precision without compassion is hollow.
A hospital requires both. The clinical engineer ensures the machine breathes for the patient, but the human presence, the touch, the listening, the empathetic gaze, is what gives that breath its meaning. Technology without dignity is just mechanics.
Wow. Surviving Cook County proved that Bandra was a master at repairing physical machines under immense stress. But the memoir transitions into the next phase of his career, where he takes on a much more difficult engineering challenge. To truly change the ecosystem of a hospital, he had to stop fixing circuits and start fixing the systems of people.
He moves away from the workbench and steps into executive leadership, eventually becoming a system director. And he quickly runs into a fundamental truth of organizational dynamics. Managing human beings is exponentially more complex than repairing a ventilator.
I laughed when he described this transition. A machine, no matter how broken, still obeys the laws of physics. If you apply the right voltage, it will respond predictably. Human beings do not obey the laws of physics.
Not at all.
He talks about learning to absorb the anger of the clinical staff. When a surgeon throws a fit because a monitor went black during a procedure, Bandra had to train himself and his staff not to take it personally. He realized the anger wasn't about the monitor. It was the manifestation of the crushing, terrifying responsibility the surgeon felt for the patient's life.
Understanding that emotional context is what separates a technician from a leader. And it is why Bandra placed such a massive emphasis on mentorship. The book spends a significant amount of time detailing his relationship with a young technician he hired named Pete.
I want to talk about Pete. Because Pete wasn't some charismatic genius who was inventing new machines. What made Pete so special?
Pete was meticulous to the point of obsession regarding documentation. When Pete repaired a piece of equipment, he didn't just scribble fixed on a work order and move on. He documented the exact part numbers replaced, the results of the electrical safety tests, the precise calibration values, and the time the unit was returned to service.
Why does that level of paperwork matter so much? I mean, it sounds super tedious.
In the realm of clinical engineering, documentation is not bureaucracy. It is the literal safety net of the hospital. It provides traceability.
For lawsuits.
Yes, and audits. If a patient is harmed by a device, the FDA or the regulatory bodies will immediately demand the service history. Pete's meticulous records prove that the hospital was operating within safe, legal, and physical parameters. Bandra recognized this quiet brilliance and mentored Pete relentlessly. Decades later, Pete evolved from a bench technician into a system director, managing the technology for multiple massive hospitals in Milwaukee.
It perfectly illustrates that when you invest in training a young engineer to care about the details, you aren't just filling a shift schedule. You are literally building the future safety infrastructure of the healthcare system.
But effective leadership also requires defending that infrastructure against misguided corporate interference. The memoir details a clash that perfectly encapsulates the tension between modern medical business and clinical reality.
I love this story. So Bandra returns to Cook County years later as a director, but the hospital's clinical engineering department has been acquired and outsourced to a new, massive corporate entity. And a vice president from this new corporation flies in and schedules a high-level meeting with the deputy director of the hospital.
We need to understand the profile of this corporate VP. He is an executive who views the hospital entirely through the lens of spreadsheets, profit margins, and efficiency metrics. He has never stood in an operating room at 3 in the morning trying to troubleshoot a failing anesthesia machine while a patient is open on the table. He views clinical engineering as a line item expense to be minimized rather than a clinical necessity to be optimized.
So they sit down in the boardroom. The VP opens his briefcase and starts pitching his grand vision for streamlining operations, cutting costs, and reducing redundancies. And within 10 minutes, only 10 minutes into the presentation, the deputy director of this legendary battle-hardened trauma hospital just holds up his hand and cuts the executive off entirely.
Shuts him down.
He looks at the VP and says, "Please be better informed before you come to a meeting like this." And he abruptly ends the meeting, kicking the VP out of the room.
It is a brutal rejection, but a profoundly necessary lesson in healthcare administration.
Why did he shut him down so fast, though? Was it just arrogance?
Because in a high-stakes clinical environment, leadership credibility cannot be purchased with business jargon. It is earned through a demonstrated understanding of the clinical reality. If an executive makes operational decisions based purely on a financial spreadsheet, like mandating the use of cheaper, unverified replacement parts, or cutting the preventative maintenance schedule to save labor hours, they don't understand the physical consequences.
And people dying.
Yes, they don't understand that a delayed repair means a trauma patient doesn't get a CT scan. The deputy director recognized instantly that the VP didn't understand the biological stakes of the machinery, and therefore he could not be trusted with the contract.
Trust in a hospital is built entirely on the understanding of invisible risks. And Bandra shares a story from his own time as a technician that proves just how invisible and how lethal those risks can be. The incident with the trace gas analyzer in the operating room.
This narrative perfectly highlights the engineer's role in protecting the protectors.
Right. Bandra is called into an empty operating room to perform a routine preventative maintenance check on an anesthesia machine. He walks in, turns on the lights, and looks at the machine. Visually, it is in perfect condition. The dials are intact, the breathing hoses have no visible cracks, and the pressure gauges read normally. If he had relied solely on his biological senses, he would have checked the box and walked away.
But an engineer knows that human senses are inadequate in a hospital. He brings out a trace gas analyzer, which is essentially a highly sensitive mass spectrometer with a flexible sampling probe. He waves the probe through the ambient air around the machine.
And the numbers on the digital readout of the analyzer instantly spike off the charts.
The air in the operating room, which appeared completely clear and odorless, was absolutely saturated with anesthetic gas.
What exactly is that gas doing? I assume it's something like sevoflurane or isoflurane.
Correct. These are potent halogenated ethers used to induce and maintain deep unconsciousness during surgery.
Bandra investigates and finds a tiny, microscopic, loose fitting deep inside the manifold of the machine. It just required a few turns of a wrench to tighten and seal it. But think about the implications if he hadn't used the analyzer. The surgical team would have come in the next morning and spent 12 hours breathing in that invisible escaping gas.
The short-term effects would be lethargy and impaired cognitive reaction times, which is terrifying when a surgeon is holding a scalpel.
Yeah, you want them sharp.
But the long-term chronic exposure to trace anesthetic gases is devastating. It can lead to severe neurological degradation, liver toxicity, and significant reproductive damage, including a high rate of miscarriages among operating room nurses.
And if they started suffering those symptoms months later, no one would have ever traced it back to a loose fitting on machine number 4. They would have just thought it was bad luck.
Exactly. The greatest threats in a modern medical environment are the ones you cannot see, hear, or smell. The clinical engineer's job is not merely to calibrate machines to save the patients on the table. It is to rigorously police the physical environment to protect the doctors and nurses who are saving the patients.
We have spent this deep dive tracing an incredible arc of evolution. We started with Galileo looking at water moving in a glass tube. We moved to wooden stethoscopes, to ballpoint pens holding together massive X-ray tables, to the physics of cobalt-60. But the final section of Bandra's memoir doesn't look at the past. It looks toward the horizon. It poses a massive question. What happens when the machines stop being objects we wheel up to a patient's bedside and become systems that are seamlessly integrated into the human body itself?
Bandra outlines a vision for the year 2050, and it represents a complete paradigm shift. We are moving toward the total dissolution of the boundary between biology and electronics.
The technological leaps he predicts are absolutely mind-blowing. I want to break down the 5 major categories he outlines, starting with the first. Ultra-miniaturized and implantable systems. We are moving way beyond a pacemaker in the chest.
We are entering the realm of nanotechnology. Imagine microscopic synthetic devices, perhaps the size of a grain of sand, that are injected into your bloodstream.
Like tiny submarines.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
They possess the ability to navigate your circulatory system autonomously. They won't wait for you to feel a fever or a lump. They will continuously monitor your internal chemistry, detect a microscopic cluster of malignant cells, and deliver a payload of highly toxic chemotherapy directly to those specific cells, entirely avoiding the systemic toxicity that makes current cancer treatments so brutal.
The second category is even wilder. Biohybrid devices. Where does an implant end and an organ begin?
Currently, if we implant a device, the body's immune system recognizes the plastic or titanium as a foreign invader and tries to encapsulate it in scar tissue.
It rejects it.
Exactly. A biohybrid device circumvents this by utilizing tissue engineering. It is a mechanical scaffold that is seeded with your own living stem cells. Imagine a synthetic pancreas that isn't just a plastic pump taped to your stomach, but a living, vascularized tissue implanted in your abdomen. It integrates with your own blood vessels and dynamically produces insulin in real-time response to your glucose levels, powered by the bioelectricity of your own body.
The third leap is closed-loop systems. Right now, medicine is largely episodic. A monitor beeps, a nurse reads the alert, calls a doctor, and the doctor makes a biological decision to adjust a medication.
In 2050, that human delay will be eliminated. A closed-loop system utilizes complex cybernetic feedback loops, similar to the PID controllers that keep an airplane flying level.
So it course corrects automatically.
Yes. A neurostimulator implanted in the brain of an epileptic patient won't just record seizure activity. Its algorithm will analyze the electrical precursors of a seizure, predict the event milliseconds before it happens, and automatically deliver an electrical counterpulse to neutralize the storm before the patient ever twitches. It acts as an automatic thermostat for human physiology.
The fourth technology is 4D printing. We all know 3D printing, but what does the fourth dimension add to a medical implant?
The fourth dimension is time. We are talking about printing medical devices using smart polymers that react dynamically to their environment. For instance, a pediatric heart surgeon could implant a 4D printed stent into the narrow artery of an infant. As the child grows and the ambient pH or temperature of the blood changes, The material of the stent is programmed to slowly expand, physically growing in tandem with the child's biology, eliminating the need for multiple open-heart surgeries over their lifetime.
And finally, the fifth leap, breathomics and electronic tattoos. This completely shifts how we interact with the healthcare system.
Currently, we practice reactive medicine. You feel sick, you go to a building, they draw a vial of blood, and you wait 3 days for a lab result.
Breathomics analyzes the volatile organic compounds, the microscopic gases in your exhaled breath. Electronic tattoos are hyperflexible, microscopic circuits temporarily printed directly onto your epidermis. They continuously monitor your hydration, cortisol levels, and microcirculation.
So your phone could literally alert you on a Tuesday morning that your breath analysis indicates an impending diabetic crisis long before you feel dizzy. It shifts medicine from fighting fires to continuous invisible navigation.
Exactly.
But this incredible frictionless future carries an immense, terrifying ethical burden.
It forces us to redefine the very concept of medical safety.
Right. If the device is living inside you, if it's partly made of your own biological tissue, and it is autonomously making real-time decisions about your brain chemistry or your insulin levels,
Wait,
where does your body end and the machine begin? This raises an important question. It fundamentally alters the role of the clinical engineer. In the year 2050, patient safety won't just mean ensuring the power cord is grounded so the patient doesn't get shocked. It will mean ensuring the algorithms haven't drifted. It means that cybersecurity literally becomes a form of biological infection control.
because if someone hacks it,
Think about it. If a malicious actor hacks your electronic tattoo or your closed-loop neurostimulator, they aren't just stealing your credit card data, they are hacking your biology. They could induce a cardiac event from a laptop halfway across the world. When an algorithm is predicting our health trajectory and administering the cure automatically, absolute trust in the integrity of that code becomes the literal infrastructure of human survival.
okay, let's bring this all together. We have gone on an incredible journey today through the pages of Joe Bandra's memoir. We've traced the evolution of clinical engineering from the frantic, brilliant ingenuity of trimming a ballpoint pen spring to save a paralyzed radiology clinic, to the quiet, astonishing majesty of a biohybrid organ functioning inside a human body in 2050. Through all the decades and all the technological leaps, the fundamental mission of the clinical engineer has remained exactly the same. It has always been about translating the cold, rigid logic of physics into the warm, fragile reality of human healing.
It is a remarkable legacy.
Mm.
But as we look toward that frictionless future, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to ponder. As medical technology accelerates toward 2050, becoming entirely invisible, perfectly seamless, and highly predictive, what happens to our own biological intuition? Will we lose the deeply human experience of listening to our own bodies? If a microscopic swarm of nanobots predicts, diagnoses, and silently cures our ailments before we even register a single symptom, does our psychological relationship to our own mortality, our own pain, and our own physical resilience fundamentally change?
That is a profound question. If the machine feels the illness before we do and fights the battle without our participation, what part of the healing process still belongs to us? Next time you or a loved one step into a clinic or lie down inside a scanner, I encourage you to look past the doctors in the white coats. Look closer at the silent, humming machines surrounding you, and think about the invisible guardians, the engineers who keep them running perfectly. They are the ones standing in the gap, bridging the blueprint and the heartbeat. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.